Joining me live now is Sky News US analyst Michael Ware. Michael, great to see you. This happened really quickly in the end, but this has been decades of the Assad rule, Bashar al-Assad himself. In the end, what was it? Was it the October 7 attack of last year that set off this chain of events? And did it perhaps end in the decimation of Hezbollah, which was a big backer of Assad?
Well, you could argue it's both of those things. I would take it back even further. You could argue it, the DNA of this starts when the Russians invaded Ukraine. Because let's not forget, it was the Russians and the Iranians who were propping up the Assad regime. And it was Russian jets that were bombing rebels like this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Those jets couldn't show up because the Russians are overextended. And when we look at what the Israelis have done to Hezbollah, Hezbollah is a Shia group who normally would come to the defense physically with fighters of the Assad regime. They have been severely eroded. And so in many ways, this was a perfect storm. This group, led by Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, created its own luck. CNN has an exclusive interview with him, an old friend of mine, Jemana Karadish, and he explains that a long time ago, in the area of Syria that his rebel group controlled, he united various factions and they started training together.
Wow.
Militarily, they created a whole new command and control structure with officers and NCOs and various units. They've been training for this. But also, another hallmark of this organization is that, again, sort of like Hezbollah across the border, these guys don't just deliver weapons and checkpoints and men on the streets with guns. They deliver civil society and services. They put the electricity back on. They provide identity cards. So these guys have taken the model, which we've seen before in history, where it's bullets almost and ballots. Not that he's proposing democracy, but, you're fighting with one hand and yet you're taking care of the people on the other hand. So this transition of power is going to be extraordinarily difficult. You saw that Bashar al-Assad's prime minister, unlike his own president, stayed behind to help with the transition. HTS has now announced their own prime minister, and we're yet to see what kind of administration they're going to create. Now, Muhammad al-Jawlani gave us a hint in the interview where he was asked, but, you're a hardcore Islamist. And he basically told a fascinating story about how he has moderated his views on holy war and on Islamic states.
Wow.
And he's now going to have to figure out a way to work with the various factions to form some kind of administration, because he certainly hasn't mentioned the word democracy. What he did hint at is Islamic rule. But what he said is, you've never really seen Islamic rule done properly, and I am going to do it properly. And when you look at this guy's backstory, he's a Syrian whose parents had to flee to Saudi Arabia. And as he said, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I went to Iraq to help fight the Great War against the Great Satan, America, and I ended up with the Islamic State. But then I joined Al-Qaeda because they were more moderate. But then I left Al-Qaeda because they weren't moderate enough. So he created his own group. So the nature of this administration and how it comes together is going to be not just difficult, but incredibly fascinating.
Oh, fascinating, absolutely. The evolution of this one individual, fascinating in and of itself when you talk about, his joining of Al-Qaeda because they were more moderate than ISIS. And look, there has been, not from him per se, I haven't seen that interview that you're talking about, but others on the streets, these once hardcore Islamist rebels, and they are still hardcore, but they are not talking about, Christian persecution or wanting to have this hardcore Islamist state, although not having a democracy, but an Islamist state. I mean, what does that look like, Michael? And do you think they have a clear idea of what it looks like now?
Look, I suspect they're still making it up as they go along. And let's not forget, our saviour here is still the head of a sanctioned terrorist group with a $10 million bounty on his head.
Right.
But he is looking to bring everybody together. And he hasn't used the D word, democracy, but he has said he wants to see protections enshrined in law for everybody. Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Druze, Christians, everybody. He says he wants a united Syria. Now, can he pull it off? Will these factions tear themselves apart? Will we start seeing another sort of civil war? But he's saying and doing all the right things.
Yeah.
So much so to the point that even though he's a $10 million wanted man, the US National Security Council says it's willing to deal with him because they obviously see some potential here. And let's not forget, the Russians didn't come to save him. The Iranians have been so decimated, they couldn't save him. Hezbollah couldn't save Assad. So here's a guy in an extraordinary moment in history, and we're going to have to see what he does next. Everyone says right now he's talking the talk, but let's see what he's actually done.
We will see the best option, absolutely, and that's how the US has got to be seeing at the moment. One final question, just quickly before we go, Michael. The Assad regime, including the First Lady Asma, was not only just letting the illicit drug trade flourish in Syria as their main kind of GDP source of government income to fund that gilded palace and their lifestyle and all those luxury cars that we saw, but they were heavily involved in it. We're talking about estimates of maybe an $8 billion trade, and these were drugs that when, flooding the Saudi market, flooding neighbouring countries. How did those countries sit back and just allow that to happen over the years?
Well, I guess you could say the same of anyone like Australia or America or anyone in France. I mean, where there's a market, there's going to be supply. And if Syria chooses to be a quasi-narco state, who's there to stop them, right? Because let's not forget, Assad didn't control the whole country. These rebel groups held some parts. The US-backed Kurdish groups hold large chunks of the country still up in the northeast, and I can guarantee you they're not going to let them go. And let's not forget, the Americans took the opportunity right now to launch 75 airstrikes against the small pockets of the Islamic State that still remain in Syria. So no one's had solid control over that country since this civil war began. And when it comes to narcotics, again, it's just marketing. It's the market. Where there's a demand, there'll always be a supply.
Very well said, Michael. Great to talk to you. And of course, we've been promoting the podcast that we did with you all week. A long conversation. You and I spoke for hours. I enjoyed it, and a lot of other people have too, Michael. So I appreciate you giving us the time as always. We'll see you soon.